Thank you. So I'm Federico Pecora. This is joint work with several colleagues. The journal presentation is a presentation on the journal paper. The journal in question is Aimed at Intelligence in Smart Environments. The work that I'm going to talk to you about today, just take time so we can go to a coffee break, deals with context-aware planning. And I'd like to start with a very brief, I'd like to start with a very brief motivation. So we really enjoy building robotic systems. These are complex robotic systems, typically composed of several sensors and several distributed components that can act in the environment. And so this is, for example, a moving table that can actually get a drink delivered to it from the refrigerator, which actually has an arm in it. But what we really get a kick out of is, in fact, planning for these systems. So actually synthesizing plan for these kinds of systems in the context of service-providing environments. And the way we like to do this is using timeline-based planning techniques for a number of reasons. I won't go through all of them, but there are well-established techniques for deriving plans, for executing plans, for updating plans and taking into account contingencies as time goes by. Essentially, this kind of technology allows us to close the loop around execution and sensing. But in watching that video, you might ask yourself, why? I mean, why is this table going to the fridge and getting a drink and all of this? I mean, well, what is it that prompted this behavior? And this is very relevant in robotics. What is it that prompts robotics behaviors? And this is a question that I usually get from lay people looking at our prototypes. So what I'm really saying, essentially, and this is the motivation in our work, is that this is an issue that has not really been looked at much in planning. Planners do not really come up with the context. The context is an under-addressed area. It's somewhat, you are given an initial condition of goal and you plan to achieve a plan that satisfies the goal. But perhaps there is an inference step behind understanding what your context is, which includes goal, initial condition, and so on and so forth. And entire timelines in our case, and then you plan according to that context. Imagine your PR2 robot going to get you your daily rations from the supermarket, and knowing that maybe you're going to go jogging today, so why not get you a Kit Kat too, or something like that, or maybe opportunistically finding things on Mars. Now, this is not an entirely under-addressed area or unaddressed area, but what we're arguing in this paper is that proactiveness is really the result of planning, but also context recognition. Whereby context recognition, we mean to infer temporally contextualized knowledge that can be used during planning to infer the state of the user, and to a certain extent, using a model, infer the goal that should be pursued, or the goals that should be pursued. We address both issues of context recognition and execution in an integrated way, and this is the main point of the paper. We address both through constraint-based reasoning techniques. Now, I'm going to try to give you in 2 slides the nutshell of timeline-based planning, because I needed to explain just a few more details. The language that's typically used is the language of temporal constraints. These are qualitative relations among intervals, typically, which are augmented, typically, with bounds. So you could say, for example, something is before something else with certain bounds. Things like this. Now, a lot of systems have been developed for timeline-based planning, starting back from ICAPS, going through the great work that's been done at NASA, and some work that's been done here in Europe. And essentially, the way you would do this in timeline-based planning, so the way you would encode a domain that describes the capabilities of these actuators is by using temporal constraints. So you would say something like, when you place placing the drink is something that occurs temporally between docking the fridge and undocking the fridge. And you would model dependencies like the fact that the fridge door should close only after the thing is undocked, like this, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, what timeline-based planners do is they build a constraint network. So they incrementally build by looking at the domain theory, performing search, perhaps even taking into account resources in addition to time, but that's beyond the scope of this talk. And they build a temporal constraint network which contains what are called often tokens or activities that represent the various elements of the plan, and these have attached to them time points that delimit their occurrence of time. Now, so essentially what timeline-based planning is a series of processes operating around temporal constraint networks. The first one being planning using a domain, such as the one I showed you earlier. The temporal network thereby obtained is actuated, or it is timelines are extracted from this, and these are used by actuation to actually deploy tasks. And what's interesting is that with timeline-based planning, it's pretty easy to do things online because you can add to this a sensing process that that models sensor information in the form of tokens and temporal constraints inside this temporal constraint network, and thereby essentially closing the loop around sensing. So, if planning is imposing known relations among contexts, let's say, and actuator commands, where the context here would be, I have to deliver a drink, and using a model of temporal relations that should exist, well, context recognition is something really pretty similar because it is assessing the existence of known relations between sensor readings and context. And since we can model sensor readings in the temporal network, say a person localization system can track you and say when you're in the living room, well, this becomes a token in the temporal network. And maybe it can see when you turn on the TV, and if these temporal constraints hold, then you can infer, or an abductive reasoning process might infer that you are relaxing. And maybe relaxing is what is modeled as being the reason for delivering a drink, and so on and so forth. So, very simple example, but to give you the gist of things. So, this is the nut of the integration. So, this is how we integrate planning and context recognition in a nutshell. And essentially, we propose a series of processes that work around constraint networks in order to build up both context and do planning at the same time. And the model, and this is an important point, the model that we use is the same model. So within the same domain, we can represent requirements for recognizing context. Very, very simple example here. Okay, you're relaxing if this is during the time that you're in the living room and it equals the time that the TV is on. Okay. But this is in the same domain, it's directly connected, again, through relations of this sort to the rest of the domain. Now, this entails that essentially context recognition can just be another process working around this temporal network. Okay? And all processes, just like planning, actuation, and sensing, and also context recognition, can operate continuously under certain conditions. So, before giving you just a few more details, I think motivation is more important than details. You can read the paper. I'd like to show you another movie where we show the role of context recognition in a more compelling way. This is a smart home where we have several sensors in the environment, and Winston lives in this home in our lab. So there are RFID tags under the floor, and these tags allow to localize a person with, for example, shoes or slippers. Of course, you have to be wearing them to be localized, but also robots can localize themselves with the use of special shoes, which interact with these tags under the floor. And the story goes as follows. Winston gets hungry and wears his shoes because he always does. And that's an assumption that always holds. And fortunately, that allows the home to track him. Therefore, when he goes into the kitchen, the home knows that he's in the kitchen, and therefore, our timeline-based planner actually can trace the fact that he's in the kitchen. That was a picture of the timelines evolving. And while he's in the kitchen, he's going to start cooking, and fortunately enough, we have a stove state sensor, which is scotch taped to the light of the stove. And actually, this allows the timeline-based planner to know that the stove is on. And in fact, we have, fortunately, also a domain that says, well, if you're in the kitchen and you turn on the stove, then basically, and certain temporal relations hold between these facts, then you're cooking. Now, some time goes by, and he's eating, but unfortunately, he's a bit forgetful. And there is also, the context that's been recognized that he's cooking, now he's eating, but since the stove is still on, there is a fire hazard. And that is the result of a temporal rule applied. But also, we're doing planning in the middle of all of this. this. So fortunately, also there's another piece of the domain that triggers an action or a plan, very simple plan albeit, of this now robot, which has to go to the person and then say a warning. Look, you forgot to turn off the stove, because it can't reach the stove. Now, it's a slow robot, so it's important that we have time-based planning here, because this allows us to propagate the delay during the execution of this thing, and the timeline, won't break. It's just an extend to the extent possible. Maybe the house will burn down. So, and that's how the story goes, and then luckily gives its warning, and the fire hazard will cease to exist the moment that some of the conditions render this pattern of temporal constraints not applicable, no longer applicable. And this is turning off the stove. So that state sensor is updated, it's now off, fire hazard is no longer there. He is no longer eating, of course, but at least he saved the party. So what you saw there was a set of processes working together. Context inference process, a planning process, a sensor update process, and an execution process. And if you're interested in knowing how the context inference process works, you can read this paper. The nut of the problem, or one of the core issues, is that doing context recognition through abductive reasoning is a relatively hard problem. And that is because the way you do it is you basically attempt to constrain sensor readings as prescribed by your model. So we're assessing whether you're relaxing when you're in the living room and the TV is on is done like that. You try unifying or pointing these constraints to appropriate sensor readings in your network, but you could have gone in and out of the living room many times, you could have turned on the TV many times, and so you have to try, in the worst case, all these combinations. Now, this is the core reason why it's difficult. There are a number of works dating back to 1993 that have tackled this problem in context recognition based on temporal networks. We've developed ourselves some heuristics that make this easier, and in fact, ultimately make it doable online. And another interesting point that I'd like to point your attention to is the fact that we need to track multiple hypotheses. So basically, when you apply your theory, you will obtain multiple hypotheses of what has happened. This may be due to the fact that your theory describes multiple explanations, for example, for a certain set of trace of sensor readings. And you probably have to keep these when you build new explanations every time there's sensing. So you can easily see how this sort of explodes. And so we also describe some heuristics for pruning the active hypotheses. And the nice thing, the interesting thing, is that there's also an issue of strong controllability here. Because we're not just doing activity recognition, context recognition, we're doing planning. And so we might plan as a result of recognized context. And if you're not sure what what may or may not be disproved in the future, then you have to figure out you're absolutely sure that happened, what is certainly an explanation of the sensor trace, and plan only based on that and not based on other conjectures. Now, we've developed some solutions that are detailed in the paper. I won't go through them. What's interesting is that this paper leads to more open questions than it answers. For example, we might start employing recent results on strong controllability by Cimatti and friends that actually use SMTs to solve this problem. Other open questions that are interesting. You might have noticed that our models are really strict, and I conclude in a slide. So our models are crisp. You relax if you're in the living room, and then you turn the TV on when you're there. But what if the sensor that says you're in the living room actually triggers a little later? Well, this rule won't apply. So one way to deal with this is to actually relax the rule, or find the best matching rule, and maybe associate a possibility to this rule, depending on how far is it from the rule that you actually modeled. And this can be done with using conceptual neighborhoods of Allen's relations. We've shown in some preliminary work that this is actually doable if your model isn't too complex. And then finally, and I conclude, sensor data may be interpreted in many ways. We tend to think in timeline-based planning that sensors are actually these nice losangs of sensor readings, but they're not really, because infrared data may tell you on, off, on, off, on, off while you're in a room, and you have to compile this into an interval. And maybe this is one interpretation, but maybe there's another interpretation and all the ones in between. So an interesting open problem is to do temporal inference on sets of intervals rather than on one interval, one interpretation. And we have some preliminary work there. So in conclusion, planning is how to achieve a goal in the current context, we like to argue. And the current context is something that may need to be inferred, and this has been so far rather simplified in the realm of planning. The criteria for inferring both context and plan, in fact, can be specified as temporal constraints, be specified in the same language, and we use timeline-based approaches because this allows us to do continuous planning, actually now continuous contextual planning. And we've shown that it is possible to have efficient algorithms to do this, and we do think that there's a lot of more work to be done, but we think this is a direction, contextual planning, that should be addressed more. And thank you. I'll open the questions.